coming from in the world today. Wonderful blue sky, lots of hope in the air out there in Buenos Aires. I was in Brussels a week ago, and I remarked that, boy, that was a heavy gray sky that was hanging over Brussels that day. I think they had some Brexit negotiations going on that day. And that I had just flown in from Washington, where the sky was blue and so on. Of course, I left Washington this time around, and it was snow on the ground, blustery. All the airports were frozen in. There was a real ice descending on maybe on the global trading system. But it's wonderful to be here in Buenos Aires and to be enjoying the summer weather here in the Southern Hemisphere. Thank you so much for being here, for packing into this theater on a beautiful day. My name is Shawn Donnan. I'm the World Trade Editor of the Financial Times. I'm not going to run through everyone that you have before you on this panel here, because you have their bios in the materials for the conference, I believe. Ricardo, is that right? And you have some wonderful signage as well up here on stage. We've got a great panel here, and really looking forward to having what I hope will be a conversation rather than a series of declarations about the state of the global economy and global trade. Really a conversation about the happy news in the global economy and the global trading system right now this year, with the WTO, of course, predicting 3.6% growth in global trade this year, which is the best in recent years, and brings us to the end of what has been a pretty miserable post-crisis pattern, hopefully. And that's one of the things we'll talk about here. So we're just going to kick it off with Ricardo, who's just going to offer a few welcoming words and get us going. Ricardo, why don't you kick us off?
Well, thank you. Is that on?
It's coming?
Okay. So thank you, Shawn. Let me just use English very quickly with big excuses to the Argentinians. Yo hablo en español perfectamente. Soy bogotano, soy colombiano, crecí en la región, adoro esta región. But just to be efficient now, I'll just go very quickly in English. So thanks to all of you for being with us. All of the audience. This is, since 1996, ICTSD has been making efforts to provide a platform for multi-stakeholder engagement on trade policy in the construction of the trade and investment frameworks that really govern the global economy. And doing so with the aim of promoting sustainable development. So I know you can read all that in all the ICTSD material, but I want to make sure that you understand that this is how we do this. We have very modest resources. We are a modest organization. We've been operating for 21 years, but we aggregate through what we call knowledge brokering. And this is what you're seeing here. This is bringing best minds, best institutions, producing analysis, evidence for good policy, so that good policy, those good frameworks on trade and investment, again, do support the ideals that we have, the concerns that societies have, address issues related to climate change, to inclusiveness, to the crisis in fisheries and oceans, to the new technologies, and all the changes in the geography of the global economy and trade. So I think that that's the best message I can leave you with right now. Before we start the panel, perhaps to trigger the discussion on where we are and what's the relevance of Buenos Aires and this ministerial conference in, again, the governance of this economy. I want to be an optimist, and in ICTSD, we're looking forward. We're always looking forward. The E15 initiative, which we undertake with the World Economic Forum in the past few years, convened about 400 experts from around the world to produce options for the global trade and investment system towards 2025. We want to look at the future. What is it that we need in the economy and in the world as we move forward? Look at demographics, look at resources, look at the shifts, again, in business models, the role that technologies are playing, and understand what is happening in that context. Contextualize what's going on here in MC11. We're going through a transition, and it's a transition that should give us a better world, not a more complicated, nor a more difficult, not a more conflicted world. That's the thing. This is the role that governments have at the Hilton right now. They want to make sure that whatever comes out of the MC11 it's a program towards managing that transition. That transition that includes the incorporation, the very fast incorporation of the Chinese economy to global markets, that changes, of course, in the way in which different actors in societies participate in global markets, in what is an ongoing and probably impossible to if you like, to completely bring back into the box what is an ongoing globalization process. That's what matters really. And so that's the role here. We have a great trade system that is essential to the governance of the global economy. It is good, but it can be much better. And that's what we're here to make sure that we make it much better.
All right, so we've led off with some optimism from Ricardo. I'm going to come to you, Sigrid, Kaag, and this question. So we've got these wonderful global commerce is moving again. Things are getting better in the global economy, but we do have these kind of dark clouds hanging over, the threats of protectionism and so on. As you come here to Buenos Aires, and I should mention to everyone here that you landed about 2 hours ago, is that right, here in Buenos Aires? So we applaud you for making it so quickly here. But what's top of your agenda this week?
Oh, top of agenda. And I want to take off where Ricardo concluded. I think it's about governance, effective governance, but of course a continued buy-in at the highest political levels of the future of multilateral systems. And we were just speaking off camera. If you look at tendencies to, because a system is not perfect, one doesn't opt out. One works to improve it from the heart. And you do that in an inclusive manner. I think the work that actually Ricardo does in other fora, it's all about stakeholders, dialogue, but for results and outcomes. And I think the WTO and the agenda it sets is still the only real game in town. We may have parallel complementary efforts, but if the world cannot continue to agree to meet, discuss, and come to progress, we're really in a dire state. So we have the choice now, I think, is quite historical. All systems, all multilateral fora from the Second World War in a way are all up for review. You see it politically in the UN, the SG is leading a reform agenda, WTO sets a program of work, but opting out for a country such as the Netherlands, a committed multilateralist that gets its strength and makes its contribution in an optimal way when we work multilaterally. We work effectively, we have gains, and we look at the world as one of shared values. Shared values means shared welfare and shared security. And it's the collective being. So the cloud, I think, is there, but it's our responsibility to push back, not wait. We've said this in Brussels as well. There are collectives here, and the coalition of the willing can be a very loaded term, but in this case, we have many alliances of people that see eye to eye, that know how to name an issue for what it is, but come to a convergence and, in that sense, solution. If you look at the 2030 agenda, I have the beauty of being able to trade with international cooperation in the old way called development cooperation. That's a powerful mix, because coming back from the AU-EU summit the other day, what did countries of the African continent ask? They asked for access to technology, opportunities to trade on equitable and equal basis. They asked for knowledge, and they asked for employment investments. The WTO can be a key driver in this at the highest level. So I see opportunity, but it's up to us, politicians, and widely supported by data, by studies, by stakeholder initiatives to make this happen. So clouds are there, but you know the Dutch we have the best painters who everybody visits in also museums in the US and elsewhere because of their skies. The beauty is in the detail and the nuance, and we're looking for nuance.
So the Dutch do good clouds.
We do great clouds, and they sell well.
Unfortunately, we don't have Roberto Azevêdo, but we're here today, but we're very privileged to have Frederick Aga. Just want you to jump in there, Mr. Deputy Director General. And we've heard from the minister already, and at the plenary this morning, it's been remarkable, and at the opening session last night, from a lot of members, this defense of the system. Is that the big theme that we should be looking for this week?
Yes, I think we need to face reality. And economic reality, both in history and to date, is that trade works. Trade works for everybody. There is no one size fits all. So each country needs to look at trade based on its economic circumstances, its political situation, its geography, and even its population size, because all these factors determine how you can participate and benefit from trade. The key thing is, having taken your circumstances into consideration, you now need to have a stakeholder dialogue. It means governments and business working together to set an agenda. So whether you now decide to use a multilateral approach, which the WTO provides, or in some sectors, use regional approaches or bilateral approaches, depending on the priorities, all these together will work for you. But you need the WTO, you need the multilateral frameworks to do quite a lot of things. First, there are certain issues that you cannot resolve bilaterally or regionally. You need a multilateral framework. Second, it is also important to recognize that for some countries, getting into the trading system is a challenge. So they need WTO technical assistance to help them move, and other instruments like the EIF for LDCs, the Aid for Trade to deliver. But overall this, I think this is where the politicians need to come in. All along, you need to re-engineer your trade policy to reduce costs and enhance competitiveness. So when you have problems, you don't look for the easy scapegoat to say, oh, this is anti-globalization, trade is responsible for this. This will evolve. So you need to have that stakeholder dialogue that continues to set your priorities, and you link them into whatever we are doing in the WTO. And just to conclude, I think we all know that even the WTO has evolved. It started off as a system that was looking at tariffs. When we discovered that people were circumventing tariffs, we started looking at some of the behind-the-border measures under the Tokyo Round Codes. And today, the landscape is different. So really, members should also engage in the WTO to find a different system, to redefine the system, to strengthen it and make it work better for them.
Great, thank you. Rick Samans, from the World Economic Forum, want to come to you. Really, let's get back to this question of this mix of sort of happy economic times. I mean, the OECD and the IMF keep telling me and others that the world is looking pretty good. The global economy is looking pretty good. We're seeing kind of synchronized growth around the world for the first time since the 2008 crisis, really. And at the same time, we've got this tension in the global trading system. Just want you to respond a little bit to our first three speakers here and build on that a bit.
Okay. Yes, I suppose that there's happiness if you look at what is being measured there, which is growth. And what is growth? It's the total annual production of goods and services. And that's per capita, so that's a mean concept. It's not a median concept, and politics really operates at the median. Moreover, most households, which is really the operative level of thinking about what matters politically, most households, they're not so much interested in what is posted in the financial pages of their newspaper as to the last quarter GDP growth number. They're much more, the set of issues that they're more interested in is what effect has there been forward or backward with respect to their living standards. And the living standards of a household, of a family or whatnot, is income, it's employment opportunity and prospects, it's security, basically a margin of safety, if you will, and quality of life, which goes to their connectivity to work, the quality of their infrastructure and public endowments of various things that really matter for their living standards. And so this is a little bit where we get this disconnect, I think. in thinking about, well, if the economy is growing well, and most, so-called enlightened people, like most of you, if not all of you in the room, think that international cooperation and the multilateral system are vitally important, well, why is the politics of this moving backwards rather than forward? I would submit in a friendly, gentle way that we still, and including this year, down here, have a bit of a disconnect about what the solution is. I think it's altogether important for the WTO ministerial here to make progress where it can. But the problem is that when we define the system, how the system is operating, we've got to define the solution to this issue is to take that definition and move beyond what has traditionally been on the table in negotiations among trade policymakers. And by that I mean, go back to what I said at the beginning. What matters for progress in median living standards? Not what matters solely for the volume of trade or indeed for the volume of GDP growth per capita. Now, maybe that sounds a bit abstract, but let me just take a minute. I know maybe we can get more into the details later. So the definition of system here and what we need to focus on needs to expand in a couple of respects. One is that trade policymakers largely are not the people who have control over or influence over the things that most affect the pace of domestic median living standards. Most of these really is affected by the strength of domestic institutions and structural features of the economy. And in this day and age where we are knitting together our economies so tightly, not just in trade, but also in investment and services, those domestic enabling environment and institutional features are fundamentally economic policy. They strongly affect trade policy, the politics of trade policy. So we need a broader integrated strategy between domestic and international economic policy within governments. Secondly, a second dimension by which our conception of what we need to work on needs to broaden is at the international level. So as I said before, trade negotiators focus typically on disciplines, on formal norms of behavior. But in fact, for a range of issues that affect living standards and the ability for trade to engage more small businesses and benefit productivity and income growth among working people in populations, it's as much, again, things in the enabling environment that are the main impediments to the diffusion of the benefits of trade more widely. Those things are not really the stuff of trade discipline negotiations, let alone formal legal multilateral norms like that are on the table here. Now, I don't want to go on too long here, but let me just set the frame that way. But if you look at this through that lens, then there are two things that shake out. One is that domestic institutions in about 15 different areas that we've identified are where the win-wins domestically are for both growth and improved median living standards. And then on the international side, there is in fact a new agenda of international trade and economic cooperation, not just the narrow trade negotiation aspect of that could significantly improve the contribution of international commerce and investment to living standards improvements in countries. And I'm happy in a later part of this conversation to then kind of walk through what they are, but I thought it'd be important just to set a broader frame on the discussion for now. Thank you.
Great. That's really useful. Am I on here? Yeah, there we go. That's great, Rick. Thank you very much. That's really useful and a lot there that we can come back to and drill down. Félix Peña, I'll just ask you to weigh in here, and I know you want to bring some Spanish into the panel as well, into what has been an Anglo-centric panel so far.
Creo que lo natural es que hable en español aquí, pero sobre todo lo natural es que hable en español porque ayer creo que todos estuvimos escuchando a los presidentes y me da la impresión que quedó muy claro dónde está el tema central del sistema de comercio internacional hoy. Y el tema central del sistema internacional hoy, creo, por lo menos así lo dejaron entrever los presidentes, está en ponernos de acuerdo si estamos preparados para tener un sistema orientado por reglas, teniendo en cuenta de que las reglas fueron definidas en un mundo muy distinto al actual, en términos de poder relativo a los países, en términos de número de países, me estoy refiriendo al momento de que se creó el sistema, cuando se creó el GATT, en términos de lo que era el comercio en aquel entonces, en términos de lo que era la tecnología vinculada al comercio, un mundo completamente distinto. Pero ese mundo originó unas reglas que hoy en día están produciendo, por parte de algunos de los protagonistas, incluso de los protagonistas que más tuvieron que ver con la definición de esas reglas, una sensación a veces no muy explícita, no muy clara, pero de malaise, de molestia con respecto a las reglas. Y queda flotando una cierta idea que me da la impresión que al hablar en español uno puede tener más fuerza al hacer esta analogía a lo que sería la sensación que tendríamos si en vísperas del próximo Campeonato Mundial de Fútbol algunas selecciones nacionales dijeran las reglas las pongo yo y los árbitros los pongo yo. En una palabra que se esté cuestionando el sistema como tal. El sistema son reglas y el sistema son instituciones que permiten preservar y aplicar las reglas. De alguna manera, y para preservar o para mantener algún porcentaje mínimo, si se quiere, de expresión en inglés, yo creo que tenemos que entrar a este año próximo sabiendo that we have a problem and that we have a serious problem with respect to the quality of the international trade system y la capacidad que tenemos nosotros de asegurar que se puedan adaptar las reglas a las nuevas realidades. Y termino señalando que creo que aquí es donde viene un vínculo muy fuerte entre los temas que estamos analizando hoy y los temas que también en Buenos Aires vamos a analizar en el G20 del año que viene, que de alguna manera tienen que ver con la capacidad de un grupo de países que precisamente se organizó como grupo porque se suponía, o se supone, todavía no sé si ponerlo en pasado o en presente, que eran los que tenían capacidad de ser rule makers o de acordar con los otros países qué tipo de reglas necesitamos. Yo creo que ahí está el tema central en este momento, con claros efectos políticos, económicos, pero sobre todo, con muy claros efectos sobre la preparación que puede tener, la convicción que puede tener la ciudadanía de nuestros países de que estamos hablando en serio sobre la posibilidad de tener un sistema de comercio internacional que funcione.
Great, thank you very much. I want to just drill down a little. We're going to come to that question of the rules makers and the rules takers and the rules abiders and the rules cheaters, perhaps even, as Donald Trump keeps talking about them. But before we do that, I wanted to come back to something that Rick, a point that Rick brought up and launched us into, which is that kind of disconnect between the system and the folks out there. And there is, as this morning, as I was listening to the plenary, I tweeted out that it was amazing to watch all of these people defend the multilateral system. And Danny Roderick, the Harvard economist, quickly tweeted back and said, this is a completely mistake in terms of responding to this. We shouldn't be defending the system. We should be understanding how the system is viewed out there and the issues with the system and responding to that and that question of fair trade. Sigrid, I wanted to come to you on this question. Do you see that disconnect between that conversation that you're having over there, or you're going to be having over there at the Hilton, and that kind of the broader world and that broader suspicion of globalization that we've seen?
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point, and it's obviously clearly something so far we've collectively failed to either understand and let alone address properly. But I want to come back to the comment by the last gentleman in terms of the value of working globally on issues that are of common concern and which require shared solutions, negotiated outcomes. I think that stands. Our inability to communicate that actually in today's world complexity, be it from transnational crime, corruption, terrorism, and trade. The trade is the more positive side, obviously, particularly when it's inclusive and sustainable, that we don't manage to bridge that either within OECD settings, let alone outside. There is an issue there, and it's bigger than trade. Actually, trade is just a symptom. The fact that people rally against WTO, they could also rally against the Security Council, they can rally against the Global Compact on migration that's being negotiated. It's systematic and symptomatic. So there is an unease against politicians, the same as it would have been against Brussels. That unease, wherever you are, exists. It's clear that the state, in this case, because the states mostly negotiate, need to reach out more. The level of inclusion needs to be even more greatly enhanced. But there comes a point where decisions need to be made and national responsibility needs to be carried. And that doesn't mean that you need to give in, that's my concern, to populism. I'll come to my own country. We have a significant populist tide as well. And the voice is that we, the citizens, are being ignored. The response is to ignore it is not the right one. Everywhere we go, we need to listen, understand, unpack, try to bridge as much as we can, but there's always a point of national or political responsibility and accountability. And to my mind, policy is hard. It's not easy tweetable. It's very hard to explain, but the responsibility to provide the best options still needs to be held. But it can't become a technocratic, hidden, darkroom, backroom exercise. So with transparency comes also greater opportunity, and I would also say citizen responsibility, because the information's out there. We find, for instance, with trade negotiations, as complex as they may be, when the EU has managed, when we've, on our behalf, collective behalf, has negotiated an agreement, we find actually sadly, and we have to do better clearly, that most of our small to medium-sized enterprises do not make use as much of the trade agreement, which is in their benefit, as another country. So we're doing something wrong. We're either not communicating, we're not explaining, we're not managing to reach our target audience domestically. This leads to unease. I'm giving this only as one specific example, but I think it speaks to the wider form. So yes, take it seriously. We have to clearly be more creative, because we're not when we talk multi-stakeholder platforms, and I think I've observed this in other fora, we say multi-stakeholder, but we really still often de facto come back to multilateral, intergovernmental. And I think the world has changed way beyond the influence of anybody, citizen to organizations, non-state actors. Everybody is somewhere busy with a theme. And how to channel that, I think you need to go back to a core that is inclusive, but is multilateral and that works towards rules-based outcomes. Otherwise, we're working towards a rapid decline of disruptive chaos with no solution to pick it up. To rebuild is often significantly harder than to reform. But you've got to be smart about the reform. So I come back to my first message, opting out or aiming for a slow death, I think risks being close to suicide. Thank you.
Ricardo, you're nodding vigorously there.
I am, because I think this is a perfect pitch, even for ICTSD, I'm sorry to say, but that's exactly what we do, meaning we understand the complexity of crafting and setting up norms for international trade and for the international economy, and for governments to do so, and the reason for governments to do so. But then there are other instances of governance at the international level that could provide the kind of reference that the minister is talking about. And there's Agenda 2030, there's the Paris Agreement, which have now been built on a different culture of wider participation, in a recognition of transnationalism, of the role of the non-state actors, of the subnational actors, and so on. And they should serve, and that's the point actually of this plenary here, they should serve as the reference for the multilateral trade system and for the international trade and investment system to align themselves with, again, the kind of concerns, the objectives that societies now have defined for themselves and have set on those instruments. And so I think that you have to play with the different levels and the different instruments, again, of global governance. And trade, in a way, because of the history of the trade system, has remained detached, if you like, very much delinked as well We, as I said in Geneva, we have 20 years of pushing for issues that at the beginning would make many of the trade negotiators roll their eyes back. Many of the issues that are top on the agenda today, coming out here with ministerial declarations, when we brought them up to the table, some people said, well, those are ponytail issues. And so that kind of gulf has to be bridged. And that bridge can only be made by the governments themselves that have to understand, again, the politics at the national level and at the international level and how they can really float up to the governance mechanisms. And I bring in the G20 as well, which I hope you do, because this conference takes place, again, at the moment that Argentina takes the presidency of the G20. And the G20 is a great mechanism also, because of its nature, to make that bridge.
Frederick, one of the remarkable things in the last few years has been watching the WTO become much more engage a lot more with both its critics, but also with this question of and admit this idea that not everyone has benefited from trade and that more needs to be done there. Just walk us through a little bit what the WTO is doing to try and bridge that disconnect that Rick was talking about.
Well, I think one of the fundamental realities of life is that people would never agree on how the benefits of trade are shared, whether it's between countries or even within countries, whether it's within a sector or even within subsectors. So this is the reality. And I think this takes me to the point Ricardo made and I had tried to flag. How does government organize itself to get stakeholders identified with the economic priorities that it wants to pursue? If you do this, then the benefits for trade become obvious to everybody. The losses that we accrue, either from trade negotiations or policy reforms, are understood by everybody. Then you can begin to work out a roadmap of policies to support those who are going to lose, to enhance the competitiveness of those who are going to benefit. In that way, the current outcry of everybody losing comes in. Unfortunately, there are success stories, and this conversation should not be about the WTO. This conversation needs to be, by all of us, about those who are benefiting from trade and from integration out there in our small little corners, whether country, local governments, or even municipals. So I think the challenge for us, what we try to do in the WTO, is to look at those who are most vulnerable. So you have a program like Aid for Trade Initiative, which brings resources together to help those who cannot produce, enhance their productive capacity to produce and trade. We try to also train some of the government officials to better understand the WTO agreements. It's one thing to be a member of the WTO. It's another thing to understand your rights and obligations under those agreements, even notifications. Today you hear transparency as a problem, but just because some of the officials don't even know the notification requirements under the different agreements. But at the end of the day, at least from the point of view of the WTO, each member, it's not a matter of ideology. Each member needs to determine its development strategy and which aspects of the WTO agreements can help it develop. And we have, through the enhanced integrated framework, for example, helped even LDCs do trade diagnostics to understand the challenges they have and provided assistance. So today you have small mango farmers in Senegal, in Mali, exporting to Europe. How that kind of success, how those kinds of success stories are replicated and broadcasted and defended around the world should be the issue. But if we are thinking of the former North-South dialogue, where everything maybe in the WTO agreements is about developed countries and developing countries, I think we miss the picture. Because today, if you look at a lot of the proposals around the table, it's not developing countries, it's a mix. Even LDC supports some of the issues. So that should be the focus of our conversation.
Okay, well, on that note, let's move in that direction then. Rick, I want to, before we do that, I want to come back to you and on this question of the disconnect. Is there anything you want to add before?
Yeah, I think the case I made before was, let's get the North Star right. I know we're in the Southern Hemisphere, so there needs to be a different metaphor, I suppose. But
Southern Cross.
The Southern Cross, let's put it that way. What's the policy anchor? And fundamentally, we're not going to get at this disconnect unless we have an alternative, a wider sense of what the policy anchor is. And I'm making a case that it ought to be living standards, median progress in living standards. And that's really, it includes growth. Growth is fundamental. Economic efficiency really is the sine qua non of progress in living standards. But there's a whole series of other structural and institutional aspects of economic policy that really matters for how well the opportunity and living standards diffuse widely within the population. And that we need to see trade policy within that context and think, well, what are the things in the international trade cooperation domain that would contribute to that? Rather than have it the other way around and say, well, growth is the most important thing, therefore we need to improve efficiency, trade is an efficiency tool, and then we'll figure out how to deal with the losers afterwards. I'm sorry to belabor the point, but I don't think we're going to get past this disconnect until we rebalance our notion of what constitutes economic performance and therefore what the priorities are in economic policy. Now let me get more specific because I know this is more conceptual thus far. So on the domestic side, and I am very encouraged by what I hear about the Argentinian G20 presidency agenda, because as I understand it, it's placing future of work or future of jobs considerations in there. This is exactly my point, is that there needs to be a domestic component. We've identified 15 areas in our Inclusive Growth and Development report that we issued earlier this year that really are win-wins, institutional win-wins for growth on the one hand and better equity on the other. But there's a cluster of them that are actually fundamental, which is the ones that the G20 presidency seems to have identified here. And we've done some numbers, cross-country numbers on this. So equity of access to basic education and equity of access to the quality of that education. Not enough just to look at the enrollment numbers. Secondly, school to workforce transition. There you need a public-private approach because you need to have a very good understanding of what the skills requirements are and where they're going to be in 5 or 10 years. And then you need some public investment where the strategy follows behind the public-private understanding of the job market. Thirdly, active labor market policies, which is basically a technocratic word for talking about dislocated worker training and job matching adjustment. Gender parity. There are lots of countries that have a very economically inefficient gap in employment and incomes by gender. Huge missed opportunity for both growth on the one hand and improved inclusion and living standards on the other. Fifth, non-standard work arrangements. In many countries, because of technology, much, if not most, of new employment arrangements are not in the traditional fixed mode. They're temporary, non-standard, contractual, or otherwise. Most of our countries, whether you are a very well-advanced country or you're not a very well-advanced country, their labor law legal framework, let alone their social protection frameworks, are not up to speed. They're not matching that. You can't solve the trade disconnect unless you take a serious look at these features, and maybe others, of the domestic human capital and labor income and opportunity side of the equation, and countries invest in it. They decide to increase their investment in it. That is part of trade policy in my mind. It's part of a joined-up policy. That's on the domestic side. Then on the trade side, our E15 initiative here, we laid out a series. If you had as the top line a Southern Cross or North Star, that living standards is what matters, inclusion and sustainable trade policy agenda, then you look at the world in a different way. And so the report we issued about a year and a half ago laid out a whole agenda of things in the trade cooperation domain which would contribute to both of them, and they'd be win-wins for both growth and for living standards. And I will just tick off the topics because we don't have time to go into the details of them. But yes, e-commerce. A lot of the e-commerce agenda is not a multilateral normative agenda. It's about getting the enabling environment, the e-signatures, the customs arrangements, the single windows for small service providers, digital windows to scale. Second area is finance. Developing countries have had huge problems because of the so-called know your customer chilling effect on trade finance. That needs a piece of serious effort on the international level. Public-private financing of a much wider sustainable infrastructure investment agenda. This is the most important ticket price for the SDGs, yet we're really not scaling that kind of investment properly. That, if we did those things, we took a look at investment policy, like we are doing now with the Dutch government, ICTSD and we, at looking at a modern approach, a model investment framework for the 21st century, where you have obligations on both the corporate side and the government side, and you're looking at a range of ways that you can make that work better for sustainable development. Institutional capacity building, and anywhere from labor, environment, consumer, very important, corruption, agencies within countries. There's an enormous opportunity for international cooperation to help developing countries affirmatively build the rules and the enforcement capacity at their own speed in these domains, which have a huge impact on living standards progress, on wages, and on opportunity and whatnot. All of these things, and I'll close here, there are other elements, including on climate change. All of these things would transform our agenda from just a narrow one trying to defend the WTO and the multilateral system to creating a much better understanding by the public that we understand what the problem is, and that within that we need to preserve the WTO multilateral system because it's absolutely crucial. But we're working what we would call in basketball terms in the United States on a full court press, a full wide-ranging concerted effort to deal with both the domestic and the international pieces that are necessary to have a truly inclusive approach to building our economies.
So one of the, coming on here? Okay, well, so I mean, one of the hard conversations that's happening over at the Hilton is the question of development and how we define developing countries. Now, Frederick Aga, you talked about the mango growers in Senegal, but Bob Lighthizer, if he was here, would make the point that the Chinese get the benefit from the rules in the same way that those mango growers in Senegal do, and in the WTO system currently aren't necessarily differentiated from Senegal. Now, that's the hard conversation that needs to happen. That's the point that he was making this morning, that I think his point was that 5 of the 6 wealthiest countries in the world are now considered developing countries in the WTO, which was a remarkable statistic. I haven't checked it yet, I should say, but he threw it out there, so I feel free to quote it, at least. Frederick, do you want to jump in there? Yeah.
I think you raised an interesting point, and it's one angle of, I'm not trying to contradict any member, but it's an aspect of the dilemma we face. And most of the times when I give this example of somebody, a headman in South Africa, he said, whatever you think is today's problem, and you develop a solution to solve it, that solution becomes tomorrow's problem. So when we started economic reforms to help developing countries grow, they were really developing countries. Now they have grown. And then you want to say, because they have grown, they are developed countries. But that is not the issue in the WTO. The members adopted the UN classification of countries. So China would argue that even though I am now maybe second or the largest global trader, my circumstances remain fragile. If I do not continue to enjoy the rights I have now, I could backslide. So the question is even for the developed countries. So this is the idea about development. Even for the developed countries that have virtually saturated and can hardly get growth rates of more than 3%, they still need markets. So the point for me, and I think the world should try to evolve, is a win-win conversation where developed country markets, very high income, high niche end, remain open for developing countries and least developed countries, for Mali, Senegal, Rwanda to sell their mangoes and coffee. And then they grow and become better markets for the products, high-end products, technology of the developed countries. If you now want them to take up obligations that you took as developed countries without looking at the social, structural circumstances of those economies, they could unravel. And I'm not sure that would be the global interest. I just thought I should flag this point.
Felix, do you want to weigh in?
Estaba pensando lo que estaba escuchando. Tengo la impresión de que uno de los temas más importantes que aquí se ha mencionado es si vamos a tener un sistema de comercio internacional hacia el futuro, que sea top-down o tiene que ser bottom-up. Tengo la impresión de que imaginar un sistema top-down como era posible después de la guerra sería muy difícil hoy de concretar. Para tener un sistema bottom-up se necesita algo que no tenemos, y es de que cada país, grande o chico, desarrollado o en desarrollo, tenga una idea clara de qué quiere y qué puede obtener en el sistema internacional. El sistema que estamos viviendo, que es un sistema claramente, a mí me gusta mucho la expresión multiplex que utiliza Amitav Acharya, es un sistema en el cual quien no sepa qué es lo que quiere y puede va a tener problemas. Pero al mismo tiempo, si sabe lo que quiere y puede y no hay reglas que permitan construir coaliciones y consensos para producir nuevas reglas, va a haber problemas. Y en ese caso no hace falta imaginar nada, no hace falta ser un máster en ningún tipo de teoría económica ni política. Lo que te da la respuesta de lo que va a pasar es la historia larga, de lo que ha pasado otras veces, en que los países no saben lo que quieren o son voluntaristas, no hay reglas y no hay forma de trabajar juntos en forma razonable. Yo tengo la impresión que ahí es donde está el desafío principal que tiene el liderazgo político. Y el liderazgo político tiene el desafío de poder captar dónde está la preocupación de fondo de la ciudadanía. Y la preocupación de fondo de la ciudadanía está en la desorientación. No me hablan con claridad, no me dicen exactamente which is the problem. Y tengo la impresión de que tenemos que detener un poco el debate, ya no solo entre los gobiernos, sino con participación de los distintos sectores sociales, académicos y demás, en tratar de diagnosticar bien dónde están los problemas de fondo. Si no, nos vamos a equivocar en tratar de solucionarlos.
Sigrid, can I ask you to weigh in there?
I don't think I disagree at all. I was also thinking, based on the earlier conversation, if we look at inclusive trade and the 2030 agenda, there's a risk that we speak mostly to the developed economies or the middle-income countries that have the policy framework in place. But if you look at the bottom tier, the fragile states, the countries and people rather affected by conflict, they might not benefit, but they understand 2030. And trade is meant to be an enabler of wealth creation. Trade is not the only channel to address issues of inequality or inequity, and it comes back to the policy environment, which in a way is globally set by the 2030 agenda. That's why it's also universal as opposed to the MDGs. We all have an opportunity and we have a responsibility. But how trade can be the biggest lever of change to arrive at growth which is green growth and job rich, particularly for the countries that need to be lifted out of poverty or people to be lifted out of poverty, I think is one of the questions also, not just WTO, but for policy coherence sake, we need to take to every forum. So what is discussed in WTO in a way is also taken in a financing framework through the bank, or what the IMF decides in terms of stabilizing the economy. I think we need to pull back some of the themes in every forum. That is a conversation that I think most of the negotiators need to take. I'm not talking about the trade negotiators now, but the government. If, for instance, my country, if we function as whole of government, we will have similar analysis, similar instructions, but we tailor it to the forum we enter. But the end goal should be inclusive green growth, which is also part of a prevention agenda. And trade, to my mind, again, here is an enabler of growth, an accelerator, but we should also look at new opportunities. If this WTO continues to stagnate, and I fully agree, it is a member-driven organization, hence it is the members that make it fail. It is not the WTO somehow as a deus ex machina, it is the membership that can set the agenda and agree or disagree. But if the agenda needs to be more ambitious, it should be about access, it should be about technology, not the unsolved business alone. It cannot get stuck in that, because the world doesn't wait for WTO decisions. And we need to look at what the new items are that give the biggest benefit to the largest group within the membership. And of course, each country, and we within the EU, will look for what are our specific interests. But I come back to the shared agenda, because opposition to what is a system that can help negotiate outcomes will only risk inflicting harm, not just on the country itself, but global. And at the end of the day, I have a lot of respect for the many NGOs and committees that speak for change and that also want to speak for the individuals that are not in these fora. We're all professionals at this at the end of the day. But if you're in Senegal and you're wondering how to deal with the plummeting prices on the market, how to get your goods, how new rules of the game changed elsewhere impact you negatively, you need the technical assistance, you need to have UNCTAD work with WTO, you need ITC, and you need to gender mainstream all the time, and you need to benchmark. SDGs are a wonderful frame of accountability for all of us, also for trade.
But I'm going to come back to you, Sigrid, because I just want to pick at this question a little bit, and that is, but hanging over this is, again, if I was Bob Lighthizer, I would argue that that's great. I agree with you. There's a shared agenda that we need to pursue there, but at the same time, I need to resolve what to me is a fundamental issue hanging out over here, and that is that one of the world's largest economies, China, is being treated in the same way as Senegal. Do you think that's something that you need to unlock, or is it something that you just can't unlock?
I think there's a tactical choice in looking at these countries, because first of all, you can continue the conversation about the redefining on which basis membership should be determined, and if there's a time to revisit that, both in the UN, because it's secretariat driven, and obviously in WTO. That is important. At the same time, I think that doesn't dissolve any member from the opportunity and what I would see as global responsibility to continue the conversation about the many other themes that are out there, e-commerce, technology. And you need to sell your all citizens the story that actually by opting out of a system, you might actually import harm. It's the do no harm principle in other fora that is equally important. But this is politics, and I know everybody speaks selectively, but I think one does not exclude the other. It's an important theme, but it should never withhold conversations, because the greater good of the agenda is lost, and I think that is more than a pity.
Ricardo?
Just a quick word, because we're very late, but on this, I think that in response to your question, to Lighthizer's concern, there's a lot of truth in that, but you have to look at the details, as in everything with trade. In the trade rules, there's been a great deal of work to calibrate the rules to situations. And so situations of development is what really matters. So yeah, it's true that conceptually there is this aggregation of developing countries, and that doesn't help much in the trade world, and I'm with you on that. We've done a great deal of work of how do you define those situations and then come up with smarter rules. That can be done, and it can be improved. It's already quite advanced in many ways in many of the negotiations. From market access negotiations to rules negotiations, you always have ways to introduce the differentiation, and it's there. So there's so much to say about that. There are more acute issues on the question of the rapid insertion of the Chinese economy and what Americans and others call state capitalism into the global economy and their role in the WTO. I agree on that. But that they have to be also addressed very specifically and in very technical words in ways in those rules. Just a quick other word on that is that I think, again, as I said before, that trade cannot be defended rhetorically. It has to be left to defend itself. And it would only defend itself as we do the rules when they perform in reference to the agendas of sustainable development, Agenda 2030, and those agendas that have been set by citizens and societies.
Rick, you want to jump in? I'm going to give you just 30 seconds because then we need to wrap up. Go ahead, yeah.
Look, we're in a multi-speed world here, and I think that's the way to deal with this issue. If there's a perception that a country or a group of countries doesn't warrant a deeper level of integration with your own country, well then go deep with the countries that you feel are on the same institutional or other level, and deal with it through positive means rather than finger-pointing, if you will. So let me close with the following notion here. So what does it mean for the WTO and governance overall? I think, number one, you can see, at least from my perspective, that I think we need a multifaceted approach on the domestic side that's linked arm in arm with the international policy. And if the Argentinians and the G20 can do that, because right now if you leave the trade ministers to their own and the finance ministers to their own, and that's the way the international cooperation sphere works, we're not getting to that kind of synergistic, and only the G20 has the ability to set that North Star, and that's why I'm encouraged by their agenda for this year. Then on the international side, basically, I think what's needed is a series of soft law and variable geometry type of congregations of interested parties on these various issues on this much broader, inclusive, and sustainable trade agenda. And what does that mean for the WTO? It doesn't mean the WTO goes away or becomes obsolescent. No, to the contrary. If the WTO conceives of the Forward Work Program as, yes, some narrow rules-based discussions inside the organization, but the WTO is the only international trade institution out there also serving as the platform for a series of soft law and other public-private discussions about improving the enabling environment and national policy in various domains among coalitions of countries that want to do that. And then on top of that, trying to draw threads and connect the dots among those emerging pieces of geometry out there over the long haul to make this system coherent, that's an alternative, a much wider conception of international economic and trade cooperation with the WTO properly positioned. And I would prefer to see myself, and this is where I'll close, with this wider conception of what a forward work program for the WTO means than just this narrow question, can we get a rules process underway, or can we create a committee?
Okay, well, there's a lot to chew on there, and I'm sure you're going to be chewing on it over the next couple of days. Got to wrap things up and move on today. So thank you so much. If you could just join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you so much.